Hello again and welcome to Leaders in Lab Coats. Today you've just got me and I want to talk about those particular moments in your career when you feel like you're being judged differently to how a man might be judged for what might be referred to in them as leader-like behaviour. And for you get the impression that although it's never called out, that you are being aggressive. And so I've been conducting some research over the last couple of months with women scientists. And these scientists have been in a range of roles, right from senior scientist to CEO. And there's a clear pattern emerging that I did know about before, but I didn't realize it was so prevalent. And this is the type of behavior that I was talking about, where you're perceived as difficult because of the way you behave. One very senior level scientist was called out for being clear and correct about a colleague's lack of competency in a performance review. And this became a red flag, not for him, but for her. And she felt that it probably derailed her promotion prospects, and she was given a clear message that this behaviour wasn't really acceptable. Now, don't get me wrong, there are ways of giving feedback and ways not to give feedback, but that is a topic for another day. What I really want to highlight here are the gender stereotypes that are still prevail in the professional world. What I want to discuss with that is the kind of pressure that we're put under as women scientists. So another women scientist I interviewed told me how she rocked up to give a presentation at a senior level meeting. This is a slightly different story. But almost as soon as she opened her mouth, one of the senior leaders started to question everything she said. She wasn't allowed to continue her presentation without constant barrage of rather aggressive questioning. And the presenter stood her ground, which is great on her part, and it didn't derail her. However, she did feel disappointed, and of course she did, and let down that this behaviour wasn't called into question during the meeting. And she started to question the culture of the company. Now, what that can result in is that person leaves and the company loses a very important and valuable member of their team. So what I want to point out here is that this kind of aggressive behaviour is often, or what's deemed as aggressive behaviour but isn't, is career limiting in women. They are often seen as aggressive and self-serving, while in men it tends to be passed over as authoritative and leader-like. And certainly this has gotten better since I started my career in science, for sure. And I'm going to sort of illustrate that progress and how really we still have far to go as outlined in the beginning of the podcast. But let me remind you of that now famous case study from the early 2000s, which everyone seems to know. And this is the Heidi Roizen case study. Apologies if I've pronounced her name incorrectly. But it was conducted by Frank Flynn, who was then at Columbia University. Heidi is a Silicon Valley executive and entrepreneur and entered the world of venture capital just before this study was carried out. Frank Flynn used her as a case study, he provided her life achievements in a document and asked his students to appraise her based on her competency, her likability, and whether they would like to work with her. But he also provided a separate, unchanged profile to half the students, but with a profile name changed from Heidi to Howard. So the results, of course, are now a textbook entry in how men and women are perceived differently, with exactly the same bio. Both were perceived as competent and effective, but while Howard was seen as likable and someone you would want to hire, to work for, and even to socialise with, Heidi was perceived as aggressive, selfish, and less likely to be a person they would hire or work for. And this is a trade-off that we make daily as women, right? Finding that balance between likable and competent is actually exhausting. We have to monitor for reactions in our audience and adjust appropriately. I talk about this more in a moment, but more often, when we speak out about being treated differently as well, we are told to grow thick skin or to be less sensitive. And I have seen it countless times in my career too. The men who get away with being the pit bull terrier and are actually proud to be the pit bull terrier, and the women who are called out for being a bitch. Even when men are called an arsehole, it doesn't seem to hold them back. But for women, it can derail their career or at least be very isolating. But the meat of this discussion today is not about the women who brazen it out, who do grow a thick skin. And this is about those women who have lost their voice in the process of trying to figure it out. Let me paint you a bit of a picture of what that actually looks like. So early on in your career, perhaps you're in a meeting, someone's presenting data, you see the problems immediately. Sample size too small, controls are missing, conclusion doesn't follow from what the data actually shows. I mean, we've all experienced it, right? And your scientific training kicks in without really much conscious thought. This is what we do. This is what we do as scientists. We question the methodology. We identify flaws and we protect the integrity of the science. And it's not supposed to be personal. It's just, pointing out that we could do better as scientists. So you speak up, but you're careful about it. You're not rude. You're not aggressive, because you've learned over the years how to raise concerns without sounding like you're attacking anyone. It might sound like this. Can you walk me through the controls here? Or, I'm not seeing how we account for. And then you wait for the response. But before anyone speaks, something happens. There's a brief pause, just a beat too long. You notice bodies stiffen slightly, eyes shift away from you, then back, and you catch a micro expression on the presenter's face. That slight little twitch that they smooth away before they think that anyone's noticed it. And then someone might say in the meeting, oh, we can discuss that offline. And yes, the tone is pleasant enough, but you heard underneath that there's an edge. But the meeting moves on, and it's just as though you hadn't raised a legitimate methodological concern. And later you check the meeting notes and you notice that the question isn't even there, or it's been rephrased as something a little vaguer or softer or less pointed. Something like Linda identified an issue without actually mentioning what that issue is. It's nothing you can point to as explicitly punitive, but everything adding up to your input is unwelcome. And I've experienced that many times over my long career as a scientist, when you feel like the comments that you're making are unwelcome. And so you notice this pattern repeating. And it may have been several times in the past month, it may have been over the year. You'll question something, and every time the room goes cool and the conversation quickly shifts away. But when your male colleague challenges, people engage with his points, ask follow-up questions, and thank him for his rigour. And when you do the same thing, they dismiss and move on. And your brain says, this is a pattern, I think this is real. And then another part of you says, you're being too sensitive. You're imagining it. You're making this into something it isn't. And this is where it gets particularly maddening, right? Because you can't prove that it's happening. You can't prove that this is resistance. Because if you try to explain it to somebody, how would you even describe it? I just feel people don't get me when I speak up, or it's just a feeling and you sound paranoid or oversensitive. I'm probably imagining it and you sound weak. So you face these two impossible options. You trust your perception and feel crazy because you can't prove anything, or you doubt your perception and you feel crazy because you know something's wrong. Either way, you end up questioning your own reality. And what makes this particularly cruel for you as a scientist is because your entire professional training is built on trusting those observations. We collect data, we identify patterns, and we draw conclusions from the evidence that we have. And you've spent decades honing your ability to detect the patterns that others miss. You notice when something doesn't quite fit. You trust your instruments and your observations. And now you're doubting that very skill that makes you good at your job. When you observe that questioning methodology consistently produces cool responses, while your male colleague's identical behaviour produces warm engagement, your pattern recognition says, same behaviour, different treatment, systemic bias. But your social conditioning says you're making too much of this, you're being paranoid, and you're the problem. But let me be clear about this. You're not imagining it, because researchers have measured it and it's well documented. And this is what's called micro rejections. Because your scientist brain, the same one that notices when sample size is 3 instead of 30, when the controls are missing, when data doesn't quite fit the model, is also exceptionally good at noticing social data. Have you noticed that? It really is. We are experts in it as women, and we are super experts at it when we're women scientists. What you're detecting are microfacial expressions, that brief tightening around someone's eyes, the momentary pulling back before they compose their face into neutrality. And these expressions last about 40 to 70 milliseconds, just fast enough that people don't consciously control them, but slow enough that your visual system and your monitoring system catches them. You're also detecting vocal tone shifts, that slight hardening when somebody says, interesting point, or you're detecting their body language, that pulling back, the crossed arms, or slightly turning away. And research has shown that people unconsciously increase physical distance from individuals they're rejecting or being rejected. You're also detecting those conversational patterns, how quickly they move past your input and whether they ask follow-up questions. And you're detecting those energy shifts, when the room was warm and now it feels cool. It feels subjective, but actually it is quite measurable. There's group dynamics research has shown that those collective emotional states are detectable and contagious. So that pattern recognition ability, which is your professional superpower, is truly detecting those patterns. You're not really imagining them. But because they're subtle, because they're at that micro level, because individually they are deniable, you can't call them out without confirming everyone's suspicion that you're too sensitive, too paranoid, or whatever. But there's something else going on here. And this is really where it gets interesting, because, and that's what I was saying about, as women, we're much better at this than men, because we were trained from girlhood to read precisely those signals. We read rooms, we sense emotional temperature, we detect disapproval, we monitor others' comfort levels, and we adjust our behaviour just to maintain the harmony in the room. And this was because our safety, or our perceived safety as a child, often depended on correctly reading whether you were too much, too loud, too opinionated, too clever, too challenging, too anything that made other people feel uncomfortable. So when you speak up in a meeting and you detect that resistance, that micro shift in energy, your entire nervous system is responding, because you were trained to fit in by reading precisely those signals. So female socialization essentially gave you advanced training in detecting social rejection. You learned to read those micro signals in the way that you later learned to read data. So it became second nature, automatic, and largely unconscious. So now, as a woman scientist, those two skill sets operate simultaneously. When you speak up in meetings, you're conducting two parallel analyses. One part of your brain is tracking the scientific discussion, and another part is scanning for social threat signals. And that is exhausting. And it's also why you're not wrong about what you're detecting. So what's actually happening? Well, I see it as a sort of violation of invisible contracts. The first is the gender contract. Women facilitate rather than challenge. Women smooth over rather than point out problems. Women make people feel comfortable rather than uncomfortable. I'm not saying it's all women, just a lot of us who do this, right? We support our ideas rather than critiquing them. And that kind of contract isn't written down anywhere. Nobody hands you a document saying these are the rules, but they exist. You know them, everyone knows them, and they're enforced through micro rejections, exactly the ones you're experiencing. The second contract is hierarchy, because junior people are not supposed to question senior people's work, and scientists don't question leadership's preferred interpretations of the data. Employees don't make management look inadequate, and team players align with the direction that's being set, right? Again, unwritten, universally understood. There's a power play in force here. And so this contract is enforced through subtle social and professional consequences. And this is the particularly unfair part, because male scientists can break that hierarchy contract and often get away with it. They're detail-oriented, they're committed to excellence, or they're rigorous thinkers. Their challenge reads as professional dedication, and they put them on the leader track. The female scientists who break the hierarchy contract also break the gender contract. And breaking that gender contract carries invisible, deniable, but very real penalties. It's an actual cost for violating invisible rules about how women are meant to behave. And I just want to interject here, because often we know that, something that we discuss as women, particularly in science, is those women scientists who really do get to the top tend to be behaving like men. They have violated the gender contract, and they often are seen as ruthless, aggressive, and not somebody you particularly want to work for, right? But let me tell you what the other aspect of this behaviour does over time. Your lived experience says that every time you speak up, you create some kind of existence, and people pull away from you and you become that person. So you're then caught. So you either stay silent and betray your scientific integrity, or you speak up and face those invisible social costs. And some women do, right? And eventually something shifts in you, because the resistance you feel from others begins to create a kind of resistance within yourself, that self-doubt, that you start resisting your own impulse to speak up. You start telling yourself, maybe I shouldn't say anything, maybe it's not that important, maybe I'm being too nitpicky, maybe I'm the problem, or maybe if I just let this one slide. You can see how it becomes a behaviour then, and that you can't break. And this is how systems silence women without ever calling them difficult. They don't silence you explicitly, they don't really have to, because you train yourself to be silent through that accumulated cost, which is individually deniable, but collectively is devastating. So it is classical conditioning, right? You speak up and then you feel the cost. You speak up again, you feel the cost. Eventually you stop speaking up. And with it, you lose that trust in yourself. And this is where we have to rebuild. A lot of women's confidence is rebuilding that self-trust. Because you start doubting your expertise, you question whether you're actually good at leadership. And each time you notice flawed methodology and stay silent, part of your scientific identity dies. And something I didn't mention before is that I have noticed this, that even very senior level scientists who would be seen by people as being very successful are thinking, I'm not sure I enjoy this anymore. Maybe I want to do something different in the last third of my career. Maybe I don't want to do science anymore. It is death by 1,000 small betrayals. So, and there's one more piece I think that is particularly painful for women scientists. It's because we chose science in part, not consciously, I don't think, but it promised to be different, right? Science is, on the surface, objective, evidence-based, and it's beyond the politics of gender. So you thought here at least truth would matter more than social performance. Here at least rigour would be valued over charm. Here at least the data would speak for itself. But you were wrong. We were wrong. Science is just as political, just as biased, just as rigged as every other profession. And that realisation, that's what keeps you awake sometimes. Not just the frustration of feeling invisible resistance, but the betrayal of the science itself. Because you built your entire professional identity on scientific values. You developed rigorous thinking to be taken seriously in rooms that sometimes didn't even want you to be there. You built credibility through precision because charm wasn't going to be enough. In fact, your scientific rigour became an armour. In fact, it felt like an armour against the sexism. So when you were dismissed for being female, you had your data, your methodology, your publications, your evidence, right? And that meant, don't tell me I'm too emotional, look at my results. Don't tell me I don't belong here, look at my research record. Your rigour protected you, it proved you belonged, it was your shield. And now that same armour is being used against you. The rigour that proved your competence now reads as coldness. Your precision now reads as nitpicking. Your standards now read as unreasonableness. And your integrity now reads as failure to collaborate. The same behaviours that make men detail-oriented make you someone people pull away from. So where does this leave you? You're not crazy. You're a woman scientist detecting real patterns of systemic bias using the same pattern recognition skills that make you really good at your job. And that's not a problem with you. That's data about the system, data that something scientists know what to do with. So the question isn't, am I imagining this? The question is, now that I know I'm not imagining it, what do I do? And that's the really hard question, is because I think most of us know this. We're all smart enough to know that, actually there's one part of us that thinks I'm really smart and I should be speaking up in meetings. Otherwise, what did I train for? And yet that other part that says, be quiet because that may be career limiting if I start throwing my weight around. I invite you to reflect a little bit here. Think about that last time you spoke up about something and you felt that resistance, that subtle kind of resistance, and notice what you told yourself about it afterwards. Did you question your perception? Did you decide you were being too sensitive? Did you tell yourself it wasn't worth bringing up again? The next time you detect that pattern, I invite you to do something very simple. Just write it down. Not for anyone else, just for you. This isn't about collecting data for HR. It is just simply trusting your science brain enough to record what you're observing. Because when you see it written down, the pattern then becomes undeniable, and then you start to trust yourself. And that's the point I want to make here, is learning to re-trust in yourself rather than let your trust ebb out of you when you continue to see this pattern over time. And I just want to say, in case anyone brings it up or feels like I haven't made a comment about systemic bias in our profession, and what I feel is that we really have to start with our own inner doubts and conditioning first before we can make and see real change. Yes, we need systemic change. Yes, we need organisations to address bias in peer review, in feedback, and in how women's contributions are evaluated. And yes, we need policies and procedures and all of that. But before we can fully address systemic bias like this, we need to be grounded ourselves, bring our confidence to the table. And not that manufactured kind, not the fake it till you make it performance, not the exhausting work of pretending you belong when you're not sure you do. I'm talking about a deep knowing that you have something valuable to contribute, that your questions aren't nitpicking, and they're about your integrity and your values. And it's not pretending that the bias doesn't affect you. It's standing in the truth of your own competence, even when the room feels cold, even when your point doesn't make the meeting notes, even when the same comment from your male colleague gets explored while yours gets dismissed. Because we can't fight systemic bias from a place of feeling like the imposter. When you're questioning whether you're imagining the resistance, you can't also hold steady in your expertise. When you're wondering if maybe you are being too sensitive, you can't also advocate for change. And when you're silencing yourself to avoid social cost, you can't also push for better scientific standards. The grounded confidence has to come first. Not because the bias isn't real. We've just spent this entire episode establishing that it is, but because responding effectively to that bias requires you to trust your perception, your expertise, and trust that you have every right to speak up about what you're observing. The system won't change by you making yourself smaller. It changes when enough women stand in their competence and refuse to be silenced by that invisible resistance. And that starts with you knowing deeply that you're enough for this work and that your voice belongs in the room. So yes, we collect the data, we write down the patterns, and we trust what we are detecting. And we do the inner work of building that grounded confidence. Because that's what allows you to keep speaking up. That's what allows you to be both competent and unapologetic about it. Thank you for listening to this episode. We'll talk more about how to build that grounded confidence in another episode.